Life is a journey of exploration, learning, and growth. Basically, the world is full of fascinating stuff. Join me, Aristides Marousas, as I uncover interesting facts and discuss big ideas on Stuff Explained from the Motley Experience. Experience your world. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to this episode of Stuff Explained from the Motley Experience. In this episode, I am going to take a look at another food item that is very commonly found on our tables and our plates. It is very prevalent in our diets, and it's a favorite of mine, a favorite of many, many people out there. And the reason I'm taking a look at this particular food item, it's a vegetable, is because I feel like it's something that, while commonly used, we do not understand or appreciate the history of and how it got to where it is today. I am talking about the powerful potato. So on this episode, I will be talking about the history and travels of potatoes. The incredible potato had a long journey from its origins in the high-altitude mountainous regions of Peru to becoming one of the world's most important crops. Potatoes are considered vegetables, but to be more specific, are tubers. Now, tubers are underground plant stems that swell to store the plant's nutrients. When mature, they can be harvested and consumed. They are also very self-sustaining in that new plants can be grown from just a part of a current tuber. Original potatoes were much smaller than the typical ones used today. It is also worth noting that there are quite a few different varieties of potatoes. There are modern-day Peruvian potato farmers that are known to grow up to 20 different varieties in their fields. In fact, the International Potato Center in Peru has preserved almost 5,000 varieties. So potatoes are not limited to just what you see in the supermarket. The way in which potato usage spread across the world is very similar to that of the tomato, which we discussed in a previous episode. The Spanish conquistadors noticed the heavy usage of potatoes and so brought some back to Europe. It was met with suspicion as it had a resemblance to the poisonous nightshade plant. Some even thought it was created by witches. Maybe the first group of Europeans to see the value of potatoes were seagoing travelers who noticed how well potatoes kept and how sailors were less likely to be afflicted by scurvy if they consumed them. It really wasn't until the 18th century when potatoes began to really be pushed onto the public, and this happened because European rulers realized that farming potatoes was a much more effective way of providing food for their people. Basically, potatoes were easier to grow and were more nutrient-rich than grains. This was a major shift as many people only harvested potatoes for animal feed. King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette of France went so far as to wear the flowers of potato plants to help influence the perception of the plant. Another example is when Frederick the Great of Prussia used reverse psychology on his people by planting a royal garden of potatoes that was guarded by soldiers. Now, believing that the plants must be something of value, people began to steal and plant their own potato gardens. Pretty smart. As the planting and harvesting of potatoes for human consumption spread throughout Europe, the frequency and severity of famines in the region began to drop. Between 1500 and 1800, France experienced at least one major national famine a decade, not taking into consideration smaller and more localized famines. It's important to remember that hunger was very much present throughout Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. Along with a decrease in overall famine came an increase in the European population, and this tends to be at least partially attributed to the embracing of potatoes as a common food item. When mentioning potatoes and famine, it's impossible to ignore the infamous Irish potato famine. So while the rest of Europe was heavily incorporating potatoes into its diet, Ireland had become almost entirely reliant on the vegetable, so much so that it wasn't abnormal for potatoes to be consumed every meal, oftentimes with only water or milk as an accompaniment. And this left Ireland terribly vulnerable to the water mold that destroyed potato crops in France, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, and England. On September 13th, 1845, the blight was reported in Ireland. In 2 months alone, the blight destroyed 1/2 to 3/4 of a million acres of potatoes. And that year, the Irish had only planted about 2.1 million acres. Over the next few years, the devastation would grow worse and worse. The potato famine lasted until about 1852, and more than 1 million Irish died as a result, and around 2 million had left Ireland, mostly for the United States. And the effects are still seen today, as Ireland is the only European country to have a smaller population at present than it did 150 years ago. Another dark legacy that potatoes are associated with is the usage of chemicals on vegetables to reduce pest infestation. American farmers began losing crops to the potato beetle in the mid to late 19th century. They soon discovered that applying a certain kind of paint would kill or stave off the bug. Further research concluded that arsenic and copper, both found in that specific paint, Paris green for those wondering, was very effective against warding off both the beetle and the blight. This is how the modern pesticide industry began. Increasingly harsh treatments would be used in the following years as insects began to show signs of immunity. In what critics call the toxic treadmill, potato farmers now treat their crops a dozen or more times a season with an ever-changing mixture of deadly substances. Nothing seems to work for long, though, as even new types of the water mold that caused the blight have reappeared. Stay up to date on all the latest content and announcements from the Motley Experience by visiting themotleyexperience.com/connect. Then enter your email address and become a member of the Insider Weekly newsletter. Experience your world. Retcon Industries provides tailor-made music for professional wrestling, podcasts, trailers, and more, while also releasing their own original music. I personally have used Retcon Industries for professional wrestling and also for this podcast. All the music you hear in this podcast is by Retcon Industries. For more information, go to www.retconindustries.com or email my good friend Greg at retcongreg@gmail.com. You can also visit them on Facebook and Instagram at Retcon Industries. Today, the potato is the 5th most important crop worldwide. After wheat, corn, rice, and sugarcane, China is now the world's top potato producer, followed by India, Russia, and Ukraine. The United States is the 5th largest producer of potatoes in the world, and it's one of the leading vegetable crops in the U.S., with Washington and Idaho producing more than half of the annual national output. About 63% of potato sales are to processors for French fries, chips, dehydrated potatoes, and other potato products. The remainder goes to the fresh market, is fed to farm animals, or reused as seed tubers for growing the next season's crop. Now, we discussed earlier in this episode how important potatoes were to the native people of Peru, and at that time, it was the Inca civilization that reigned supreme, and also to the Europeans once they really fully adopted them. And this is because of how nutrient-rich potatoes are. And now this is something that surprised me, because growing up, I had always been taught, or at least been under the impression, that if anything, potatoes were a bit on the unhealthy side. Well, it turns out this has everything to do with how they're prepared and not with the actual potatoes themselves. So potatoes are carbohydrate-rich, naturally fat-free, cholesterol-free, and low in sodium. In addition, potatoes are an excellent source of vitamin C, and those eaten with the skin are a good source of potassium, even more so than bananas. There are not any substantial nutritional differences between white potatoes and sweet potatoes, by the way. That seems to be more of a craze than anything else. Now, just some quick fun facts. The medieval words spide and spade referred to simple digging tools. And because spades were used to plant and dig potatoes, the tubers themselves eventually acquired the name spud. Now, it's believed that the first French fries were served in 1802 at the White House during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, who referred to them as potatoes served fried in the French manner, or something along those lines anyways. And so there you have it. That is the history and the travels of the potato. Mirrored very much the history and travels of the tomato. They began as highly respected in South America, were brought over to Europe, and were viewed as suspicious and even potentially as dark and evil. And then they were essentially, realized that they were super nutritious, easy to plant, easy to harvest, and ended up actually leading to a boom in the population just because they were so reliable. And now they're everywhere. You have potatoes with breakfast, lunch, and dinner, French fries, chips, au gratin, baked, twice baked even, boiled, anything you can think of, potatoes are used. And that wraps up this episode. So please reach out at Motley Experience. That's MOTLEY XPERIENCE. Hashtag Stuff Explained. Tell me your favorite potato recipe. Tell me what you thought about this episode and past episodes. You can reach out on Facebook and Instagram as well. Just look up The Motley Experience and try when you can to use the hashtag Stuff Explained. We even have a LinkedIn page, The Motley Experience. Also, make sure to visit themotleyexperience.com, where you can find links to the sources I used for this and other episodes. Thank you very much for tuning in. Until next week, stay safe and do your best to continue to experience your world. Stuff Explained is written and produced by me, Aristides Marousas. Music is produced by the talented Greg Massey of Retcon Industries. Visit themotleyexperience.com for more thoughtful original content, and you can also find links to the sources used for each episode of Stuff Explained. Like us on Facebook at The Motley Experience, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Motley Experience, and use the hashtag Stuff Explained. If you like this episode, leave a review, subscribe, and share with a friend. Thank you for listening.